Children and families are in crisis. More than ever, they're being exposed to violence, abuse and neglect. And the fallout is devastating. Welcome to Stories from Berry Street, a podcast that explores how one of Australia's largest independent children and family services organisations dedicates itself to keeping children, young people and families safe, thriving and hopeful. I'm your host, Richelle Hunt. Join me as I talk to some extraordinary people at Berry Street and discover the realities of working in child protection and family violence spaces, the incredible work that's being done to address the rising tide of harm and violence, and what we as a community can do to help. How prevalent are some of the issues of abuse and neglect in our community? What are you witnessing?
Oh, it's incredibly prevalent, but I also think it's quite hidden from the general community. If the average person knew how prevalent it was, they would be really shocked, because children are being harmed and neglected on a level that we haven't seen before.
From youth worker at Paran Mission to Deputy CEO and Executive Director at Berry Street, that's Jenny McNaughton. Her work has spanned the country, working with people from all walks of life, including those with a disability, asylum seekers, First Nations communities, as well as children and families facing trauma, violence and abuse. 10 years into her time at Berry Street, and Jenny believes the broader system keeping children and families safe is no longer fit for purpose. A bit later, I'll also be talking to Andrew Lowth, Principal Practitioner at Berry Street. He works with teams across the organisation to support some of the most vulnerable children and young people in Berry Street's care. And he'll shed more light on the difference they're making in the lives of these young people. Jenny, the term child protection is one that we hear a lot and it can seem a bit scary and unknown. So what is child protection? What does it mean?
I can imagine that it does conjure up different things for many different people, but essentially it is the system that government's developed to support families that are unable to either have their children reside with them safely or have to be in alternative care for whatever reason, and there's a gamut of reasons. So really it's the whole system around how we keep the child safe, how we help the family with their relationships with their children, how we keep children safe until they become adults, and it's a whole gamut of separate interventions and programs that make that system up.
So where would you start? How would a child come to your attention?
Many different ways. So school, we have things called mandatory reporters. So as a social worker, I'm a mandatory reporter. A school teacher is, a doctor is. So if we see signs of neglect or abuse or a child tells us about those things, we are obliged to report it to the government. And that's actually physically a line, a child protection line, and then that case will be triaged. So let's say that line gets 100,000 calls a year. The triage would be down to a tiny amount that actually get investigated.
And what do you mean by triage? What does that look like?
So it might be that 4 people have called and said similar things. It might be that the case is so serious, the child has been physically seriously harmed or sexually assaulted, so that we know that we need to do something immediately. So the triage is really what is the most critical, what is the most urgent. What can we do with the family? What do we have to do in removing the child while we make the family safer?
Wraparound services and support for families in crisis can come in a number of ways, many of which Berry Street has spent years developing, always with safety and well-being as a focus. But of most importance is timing.
Yeah, so it depends on what's happening for the family. And so we have a program called multi-systemic therapy, I know it sounds long, MST, that actively works to keep children at home and out of care. And a worker might go there 4 or 5 times a week. And if the trigger of the issue for the family is getting up, the worker might help then. If it's dinner time, they might help then. If it's getting into the car and going to school, they might help then. And that's a course over 5 months. And it's shown remarkable results, really high evidence base for that success. In other cases, it might be family services where you go in once a week and, you're talking to the parent and the child and actually trying to, through family therapy, work out what's happening. So you can see there's a layer from sort of once a week, once a month to really, really intensive.
Is that just a different way of looking at the why?
Yeah, absolutely. And we blame the parent, and it's most often it's not the parent. I mean, I think most parents really try to do the best that they can do. They just don't know how. So it's, as a community, how we teach them how. We know that if we can get in early in the life of the child and early in the life of the problem, the trajectory will be so much better. The relationship will be so much better. The trauma that everyone experiences will be lesser. So Berry Street is a really strong advocate for early intervention into family services. And most of the children that come into our care have a history of family violence. Like if you cross-check their cases, their parents would be in the system for family violence, victim survivor, and the child would be in care. Because they weren't traditionally seen as victims in their own right, and they absolutely are. And we are treating children that have been witness to such violence in a different way with different programs now, with programs that help mum and bub repair that relationship and help the parent, mum, dad, whomever, understand what it might have been like for that child to have witnessed that and really repair that relationship early.
So when we talk about the issues that you and the team at Berry Street are facing, how prevalent are some of the issues of abuse and neglect in our community? What are you witnessing?
Oh, it's incredibly prevalent, but I also think it's quite hidden from the general community. But I think that, if the average person knew how prevalent it was, they would be really shocked by what we're seeing.
Why is that, do you think?
Because children are being harmed and neglected on a level that we haven't seen before, and the community is almost despairing. I've seen a lot of really negative articles in the news recently around youth crime and, the terrible things that are happening without thinking about what's the underlying root cause of that. Why are those children out in the street doing that?
What are those root causes?
Because of an increase in drug and alcohol use, because of an increase in mental health, cost of living isn't helping anyone. Post-COVID, I think we're just starting to see the tentacles of the trouble that caused for people, because we had families that were already in a pressure cooker kind of situation then just explode, and we're starting to see the tail end of that.
So when you get to a situation where you know and understand that a child has to be removed from a home, what happens? Where do they go? Who takes them? What are the steps?
Yes, so the police will go out with the child protection workers and they will find a placement for them. It's either going to be ideally another family member, it might be, an auntie and uncle, or someone who knows them, a kin, or it might be a grandparent. If that's not available, there might be a foster carer. If that's not available, there's residential care, which is housed by staff with 4 other children. And if it's really, really serious and that child's at risk of seriously harming themselves, it might be a secure welfare situation.
How long does that process take in order to find the right home? I know there's a shortage of foster care workers. So even though you've got a list of what you can work through, I could imagine that process would take a long time.
It takes a long time. Sometimes it takes all day, and we know that there's a child sitting in child protection office all day. Sometimes we know there's a child sitting in a police cell. And sometimes we know that there's a child in a hotel with agency workers. That's, very last case scenario. But I've known of children still sitting in a child protection office at midnight waiting for someone to come and pick them up. And I can't imagine how scary that is.
In 2023 alone, 1,354 children and young people were in out-of-home care with Berry Street. As Jenny explains the complexity around out-of-home care, a growing problem reveals itself.
There's less placements because there's less foster carers. Foster carers are leaving the system at greater numbers than I've ever seen. They're not rewarded properly, they're not recognised properly, they're not funded. It costs them to have children, and the behaviours of the children that are coming in are tricky. And if you've got other kids, you might be resistant. Then cost of living, if it's already costing you money, that's also a complexity.
So is there an education campaign needed to boost numbers but to also talk about the realities? Or maybe even if, as the broader community, we have a misunderstanding and maybe even a stereotype of what residential care is
yes,
and
I
looks
think we
like,
do. Yeah.
what child protection looks like and what foster care looks like. Where do you start?
Yeah, because, residential care home just looks like a home anywhere around your suburb, but people often think it's a
big house
or
like Annie, right?
Yes, exactly. It's got bars and things like that, and it's not. So community understanding is essential. We are working at Berry Street on professional foster care so that, we have people that are social work trained or welfare trained who can take on the role of primary carer but are paid so they can stay with the child if the child can't go to school and can do all of the work that a child that's excluded from mainstream activities may require, because, it used to be the cohort of foster carers would often be a mum and a dad and a mum staying home. That's completely changed.
So how likely is it to build this army, so to speak, of professional...
There's a program called PIC, which is Professional Individualised Care. In New South Wales, it came from Germany, and there's huge evidence that it's working, and I went to visit them, and it was kind of astonishing. It was our types of children that we had, and they were really taken on by a family in every sense of the way. They were able to make decisions like a family. They were able to travel with the family, and often they ended up keeping that child as part of their family. And it's beautiful. Again, it's intensive. So they only see 50 children a year, because it is 50 children that were living in hotels mostly because their behaviours were so complex. Families couldn't cope and residential care couldn't cope.
So hang on. It's working somewhere else. We've got the evidence. How do we present this as a national solution, or at least bring it to the Victorian government?
I know the Victorian government is interested in PIC. It's the funding for that, and that's where we're hoping to get philanthropic funding to demonstrate just how great it is.
I mean, you talk about changing people's lives and talking generationally.
Yes. And, some of the stories they told me where a young Aboriginal girl had been living in a hotel for 2 years and her cousins came and lived underneath, and the workers closed the doors so they couldn't speak to each other. Now, that girl went into PIC, and now she's playing footy for one of the women's teams and is a really strong advocate for the system being broken. And you just think, what would have happened to her life if she didn't have that 2 years with a very special family who just, tolerated what was. It wasn't easy. There was rage, there was trauma, there was, all of the disbelief that they would actually stick with her. And they did.
So clearly a program like PIC has got great potential to impact young people and their families, which of course flows down to the community. But it can be challenging to get innovative, evidence-based programs off the ground.
Well, it is really difficult. I know that the numbers of people waiting on family violence lists are extraordinarily high at the moment, even though there's been really good investment. So we need to continue to lobby for that. But we need to invest more in evidence-based programs, things that we know work.
Like what? Which of Berry Street's initiatives do you think will change the system for children and families?
Single session therapy works quite well with some people. That's just like, we're actually just going to work on this once, and it might be a family issue around a child not going to school. Berry Street has got the only evidence-based program of residential care called the Teaching Family Model. That's also having really good results because it's helping young people have more structure than is generally found in residential care. And there's more coaching and support for the staff, and the young people have much more of a say and families more involved. And the goal is to be reunified with family. So that's another one of Berry Street's strategies, that residential care is safer for everyone and has better outcomes. The other thing that we're doing is multi-systemic therapy, which is 5 months. It feels quite expensive because it's only 50 families a year. But then if you think of that 50 families a year breaking that cycle and what that means for those 50 families and their whole networks, that's quite extraordinary.
So does that frustrate you if you think or believe that you've got the systems, you've got the evidence-based work that changes lives? And 50 families, that's a lot of families.
It's a lot of families.
That's a lot of families. That's not an insignificant number. How do we, as a community, as a government, philanthropists, whoever it may be, how do we get those numbers up so you can do more of this evidence-based work?
So I think that we actually have to think about the trajectory of the time and the investment required. So because of the government cycle, we tend to get funded in certain ways in certain years. And then we know that, for example, this June we have a lot of lapsed funding, so we aren't certain about what's going to be funded next year. which is really damaging for trying to plan the future programs. And at the same time, we're being told the state's in trouble. We're broke. It's going to be a really tough year. Philanthropists are fantastic and have been instrumental in getting some of Berry Street's really great programs up. So for us, it's about more of that, helping people understand the impact of that.
So we spoke about that knowledge gap in the community and some of the stereotypes or assumptions that we might have. What should people understand better? Or what should we understand about these issues that we don't understand?
I always wish that the community understood that parents aren't to blame, that generally they're doing the very best they can. By and large, parents want to be good parents. They don't know how to do it. They've never seen it. The things that have happened to them have been terrible. So if we could support them in their parenting very early, and there is some amazing programs, I think that would be amazing. Same thing with our young people. You meet them one-on-one, and I meet them one-on-one often, and they're delightful. You know, the story of the 14-year-old who's smashed into someone's house isn't often the real story of the 14-year-old who's just desperately scared and lonely and needs to try and fit in somehow to survive. You know, we do have a saying that all children want to do well and they can't, and so how do we teach them how to do well?
I'm always in awe of people that do this work, like yourself, day in, day out. How do you manage to keep going, right, okay, I can do this again today?
Because of the programs that we've talked about, that I know that as a system and a community that we can get there and we'll do better. So it's that hope, yeah.
Are you hopeful?
I couldn't do it if I wasn't hopeful. I mean, some days, don't get me wrong, it's not great. But mostly we are doing our very best to make sure that this intergenerational trauma stops and that we look after our children and families in a different way and have more respect for them and wish more for them and have much more ambition for them.
It's hard to convey the scale of the issue we're dealing with across Australia, but in April 2023, the Australian Child Maltreatment Study was published, which gives a snapshot of the kinds of abuse 16 to 65-year-olds are experiencing. Nearly 40% of people have been exposed to domestic violence. 32% have experienced physical abuse, and similarly, around a third of us have also experienced emotional and sexual abuse. These are extremely concerning numbers. So what does it look like from the perspective of people working day in, day out to make a difference on the ground? Well, Andrew Lowth is one of those people. He's principal practitioner at Berry Street, where he's been for 9 years. And he starts by telling me what his focus is each day.
It's really to work with our most complex families, our most complex situations. We work with human beings that are traumatised. We work with young people who've had really significant difficulties early in life. We work with parents who've struggled intergenerationally with a whole range of challenges. And so I guess my role is to help our teams right across the organisation manage the unmanageable, in a sense. They might come to me and say, look, we've got a young person in Shepparton or Morwell or in North Melbourne who is really struggling with their behaviours. We're trying to look after them. We've tried to support them in the best way we can. We don't feel like we're getting anywhere. Could you come in and just help the team? Is there something we could be thinking about differently?
It's interesting you say the word team. If you have someone who you know is in an unsafe environment, you know that the parents or maybe parent have their own complex issues and needs. What levers can you pull? How can you help?
Maybe if I give you an example, it will help answer that question. So there's an 11-year-old young person in one of our regional towns who was removed from his mum and stepdad's care when he was about 8.5, because of mum and dad's significant drug use. They were using methamphetamine, and Child Protection had worked really hard to try to get mum and dad to change their behaviour, try and get them into detox, really trying to help them work out what they wanted to do. So we offer residential care. We have houses in the community where we look after young people who can't be placed in a foster care placement for whatever reason, or we don't have the capacity. And so in this instance, we had a residential care placement where he was placed with 2 or 3 other young people. And when I got involved, they were really at wit's end. He wasn't going to school. He almost what I would describe as given up. He was struggling emotionally. He was really angry with mum. Why can't I come home? He was turning up at her place because he knew where she lived. He was just angry about, his circumstances. And it was really terrible. And the team were really, we really love this young person. We think he's got so much potential. He knows this is not where he wants to be. We put in a lot of work. Our team did an amazing job with that mum. So we got permission from Child Protection to work closely with her around, is there any possibility that he can come home? What would it take to bring him home? So we did get him home.
Wow.
Which was extraordinary, with what's called a targeted care package. And that essentially is a package of things attached to that family. So it might be some money to support mum to take the kids, because she had other kids in her care, away for normal things, like just down to the beach for a weekend. It might be that someone goes in every single day and helps just with that routine, helping mum think about the witching hour, when all the kids are home from school, what does it look like? Things that probably people in the community take for granted, but when you've got intergenerational issues and you don't deal with stress very well and there's histories of abuse, you do need to kind of pack things around to help people manage.
So for you then personally, what's the hardest challenge for you? What's the hardest part of your job and your role?
There's several things that are hard. The first thing is seeing teams really struggle and start to feel like they're completely hopeless. That's so hard for me, that they don't believe that they can get anywhere with someone. The core concept is about hope, and 90% of my work is with teams and where they feel hopeless. They come to me at the point where they feel like, why are we continuing to do this? We feel hopeless. And my job is to find that glimmer of hope. And I'll give you an example. We're working with a young person and she is 15 years old, and we've had her in our care since she was 11. She's in residential care and she has significant high-risk behaviours. So she uses drugs, including heroin and methamphetamine, and she puts herself at really high risk out there in the community, because with that drug use comes a whole lot of risk of sexual exploitation. And I guess the team come to me regularly and say to me, we feel so lost, we feel so hopeless that we've done everything that we think we can do, and yet we don't feel like we're getting anywhere. And so my work becomes about, how do I help the team absorb some of this?
So how did she come into your care or into Berry Street's care? How did you meet her?
She had an incredibly difficult start to life, and she was removed from her mum's care and placed with her grandmother when she was about 5 years old. And again, I want to emphasise that her mum loves her, her grandmother loves her, her father loves her, but all of the people I'm talking about have struggled enormously with relationships, with their relationship with drugs, with their coping, with resilience, with a sense of, disadvantage themselves, and lived in significant poverty where there just wasn't opportunity. And opportunity grows opportunity. And in her case, she was with people that were focused on something else, which wasn't her. And that's no fault of their own. They were having to get drugs to survive. They were doing all the sorts of things, but she was left. And, I would describe her as one of the most street smart kids I've ever worked with, because she had this incredible ability to look at you and say, "Oh, are you worried about me?" She was kind of shocked when you would say to her, "We're worried about you," because she had no experience of anyone trying to think about her or connect with her, which I found so fascinating.
Do you hold out hope for her
I
that
do.
she will be the one that will change that family's line?
Do you know why I hold out hope for her? Because, again, I truly believe if we can get her through the next 7 or 8 years, she will get there.
7 or 8 years. That's a long time. But playing the long game is the key to making lasting change. It's an investment in innovative programs and people over the long term that makes the difference.
Long game is absolutely the right word. None of this is fixed overnight, and sometimes you have to remind the team, what's our expectations here? What do we expect to get here? And is it a reasonable expectation if we just set the bar a little bit lower and see if we can achieve that? It's all right if we can't. If we set it too high, then we let ourselves down. But, I have worked in this for 30-something years, and I feel like this period, this kind of 13 to 21, 22 is a really important period in terms of this is where things will be the most hard for her. And if we can get her through this and support her, if she allows us in a bit, at some point, she will have to then make some decisions about, okay, I don't want to live like this anymore. I actually want my life to be different. And then she'll have to do the hard work. What does that look like? How can I have a life that's different? I don't want to be surviving. I want to do better. And with her, I think she's smart enough to do that. And you know how you just get a strong sense? I think she's got it, and it will take time.
So how do you make someone not feel like hopeless in that situation?
It's absolutely. The thing for me is there's things that we have to do, like we manage the risk, we try and support her to make better decisions. But the thing for me, the most important stuff that I want the team to feel is making that little pot of food for her, making her feel like someone has valued her, knocking on her door to say, "Are you okay?" Just really thinking about connecting with her, engaging with her, making her feel like she's a human being. And you might not have all the answers, but you can, just by reaching out to her and having a relationship, you can make a difference.
But when we think about child protection and going into the system, so to speak, it feels like another world that we in the community aren't connected to, aren't involved in, and have no control over.
Absolutely. And I went to a conference in Perth 15 years ago, and there was an old professor of social work. He was the main speaker, and he would have been in his 70s, maybe 80. And he said, "A few years ago, my wife got cancer, and I was away at a conference, and so I rang my daughters and then I flew home, and when we got there, there was food that someone had brought over, and then people from our church group got involved, and then we had other friends." And he said, and the difference between my life and the life of people in child protection is that they have connections and relationships and people that care, and that people are interested in valuing my life. And he said, the people that we work with sometimes don't have that. And that's always stayed with me. And yes, it is all our business, because in a way, relationships of all kinds are at the core to our healing. If you said to me, what's the one thing that's most important in terms of the work that I do. It's about getting people to realise that relationships, connection, community, engagement is the core. That's our business.
You do work within a system though, don't
Yes,
you?
yeah.
And if you could reimagine that, what would the system look like if you had control of it right now?
I would put much more emphasis on the importance of relationship. And I know that sounds really simplistic, but it's actually not. It's really sophisticated because, in essence, all of our programs need to be about relationship. All of our interventions, whether it's child protection, whether it's us, it needs to be about healing. And healing can only happen if there are an emphasis on the important things and the things that matter.
If there was anything that the general community, that general society could take from your day-to-day work to maybe just rethink how they see an issue, an individual, a child or a family, whether it be at their school, or even ask the question of who's not here, right? How can we all participate and make your job easier, Andrew?
Do you know, I think there's a couple of things, and the word that jumps out for me is about kindness and compassion. I think if they find that part of themselves that goes, why is it that that young person is doing this? What's that about? It starts to free people up. What's my part in that? And how can I help? And it's kindness.
I have to agree. A little more patience, a little more grace and kindness would go a long way. While so much good work is being done to support children and young people, the child protection system is far from perfect. It's so good to know that Berry Street will continue to challenge it, innovate, and be there for children and families facing violence, harm and neglect to give them the best possible outcomes. You've been listening to Stories from Berry Street, a podcast for Berry Street, produced by Sound Cartel. Find out more about how you can support Berry Street at berrystreet.org.au. Listen out for more episodes on everything from healing childhood trauma, family violence, providing safe homes and childhood neglect. Subscribe free wherever you listen to podcasts. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic, family or sexual violence, please contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800 737 732. This podcast is recorded on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and Berry Street acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the lands, skies and waterways across Australia.